I struggle with the idea that jiu-jitsu people know how to wrestle, and I struggle with the idea that jiu-jitsu people know how to do judo. And I think it's important that while, yes, some of the techniques are the same, they are not the same. And it's a it's a challenging conversation to have with somebody that doesn't understand the dynamic at the higher levels, because while at the entry level they are fundamentally the same, in order to get things at the highest level to work, it actually requires very specific reactions and movements from your partner in order to get them to work. So I can throw a world medalist in judo a lot easier than I could throw a high school kid that wrestles, because I can tell you that if I do A, I get the response B. I can tell you that without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, that if I do this, he will do that. But when I grab a high school kid that doesn't know what he's doing and he's somewhat physically strong and athletic and fast, when I do this, I don't know what the fuck is going to happen. It's a fucking loose cannon. And so, there's always those like degrees of understanding like what we're trying to do. And I think it's important for the jiu-jitsu community to build its own identity as to what constitutes what they're doing. When I hear jiu-jitsu people tell me that they're good at wrestling, they're fucking morons. They are not good at wrestling. At best, they have an elementary level understanding of the sport of wrestling, right? I would love to see nothing more than people who feel like they have really good wrestling in the sport of jiu-jitsu go wrestle a freestyle tournament. Like, go wrestle an NCAA event. Like, go see what it's like to really wrestle, where you can't use a Kimura to play defense. You can't use a guillotine. You can't sweep somebody over with a sumi off a single leg. You can't flee out of bounds for no reason other than you don't know how to defend a single. There are specific things that happen in the sport of wrestling that allow people to wrestle that don't happen in jiu-jitsu. When you go back to like the ADCCs when they were in China and you look at like the wrestling that was happening. I think if you watch the match with Keenan and Homolo Baral, they were shooting on each other. I think it was those two. And they were basically, their defense was, I'm going to run away because I'm slippery. And then they would slide out of bounds and then nothing would happen and they would come back to the center. When you look at like, because the rules dictate the outcome of the stand-up battle with how you judge out of bounds, like what would happen in ADCC if every time we went out of bounds, if you got 3 strikes for going out, you lose. Now let's stay on our feet. Are you really going to run out of bounds now to play defense and hopefully get back into neutral? Probably not. But without that rule in place and them always able to flee, like they can't do that in freestyle. Freestyle, you run out of bounds, you get a point against you. They're rewarded. So, like, how you wrestle and how you do certain things and how you apply the techniques, everything has to change because you're actually doing jiu-jitsu. You're not wrestling. You're not doing judo. You're doing jiu-jitsu. So when people ask me how to apply judo techniques for jiu-jitsu, you fucking don't. Because the amount of power and the amount of explosive energy you need to pull off a judo technique is insane. The idea that you can control that kind of force to make sure that when you hit the ground that you're on top is damn near impossible. The only reason why some of us can do it is because we're so fucking skilled and you're so fucking stupid. My skill outweighs your knowledge. And there's such a disparity there that I can do that no problem. But that's only because there's a disparity. No different than if a D1 wrestler goes against a jiu-jitsu guy and it's like, hey, we're only doing takedowns. You can't lock a submission to play defense. Let's see how good you are. Like it changes. Like, let's put shoes on so I have traction on the mat now. And so I can cut my angles and corners. Let's do that. Let's see how well this goes. And so you just have to be careful. So if I was going to make any recommendation to any jiu-jitsu player trying to go into another sport, take the sport on as its singular sport. Don't come into it with the mentality of like, I need to learn how to do Uchimata and I need to do it from an overhook because I do no gi and I can't grab the gi. Understand all of the fundamental principles as to why the technique works in the sport of judo. When you master that little box, figure out when you're now doing jiu-jitsu, when to apply it, how best to apply it, and how to take the knowledge that you've gained from the judo side and put it to jiu-jitsu, because you have to make it your own. At some point, every judo player, once they master the fundamental skills of judo, once they hit that intermediate and that advanced level, they start to manipulate the basics to fit their own body type and the situations presented in front of them. If you always fight people who are taller than you, you're going to do certain throws different than if somebody fights somebody who's the same height. So you can get different responses on different techniques when you're asking somebody at an advanced level, because they teach you based on their own needs and desires, not necessarily yours for the exact situation you're dealing with. So wrestle to wrestle, judo for judo, and then do jiu-jitsu for jiu-jitsu, and don't call it the other. Because I guarantee you, any of those guys that step into a judo mat under judo rules wearing a judo gi, not a jiu-jitsu gi, a judo gi, gets the shit kicked out of them. Again, it's just, there's a balance there and a knowledge there that they just don't understand.
No, I mean, yeah, I agree. It's definitely important to come in, like you said, to come in understanding that, hey, look, I'm not going to try to apply my pre-existing knowledge into this new thing that I'm doing. I want to learn this new thing from the ground up. I agree with you. It's how you build strong structures in anything.
But so, like, you can't take a technique that a judo coach teaches you and then think you're going to take that thing and apply it to jiu-jitsu and get it to work. You're going to have to do some sort of modification, adjustment, change in order to get this thing to work for you in that particular sport. Because the modifications that you make over here for jiu-jitsu, when you try to do those things over here for judo, they're not going to work. The people just won't respect it. They're not going to react the right way. They're not going to move the right way. They're not going to fall the right way. They're not, like, half the foot sweeps that like you need to know for jiu-jitsu, they're never going to work in judo, because the judo player doesn't have the mentality of, hey, I better pull guard. That's just never like a reaction that they're going with. But again, if you can learn how to tap a foot, you can take down pretty much anybody in jiu-jitsu who might at some point feel like they need to pull guard, because their mentality is halfway going down to the ground anyways. They're already looking to sit back. Therefore, your foot sweep doesn't really have to be real.
Yeah, you're just kind of accelerating what they're already trying to do.
Yeah, it's like that atrocity that like the jiu-jitsu community calls a drop seoinage, when they just drop in front of them and yank them down to the ground as hard as they can, is like that's a real takedown. It's like, no, the other guy's just terrified. He's just scared, because if he had any sort of balls, he would just stand there, and when you fell, he would just stand there, because you have no rotation, you have no lift, you have no structure. But because they're so scared, they're sprawling as you're dropping, and they're just taking their base out because they don't have the confidence to stand there. And so that technique would never work in judo, but it gets to work in jiu-jitsu because of the level and the mentality of the stand-up player. So I would never recommend anybody taking a judo technique and applying it in a jiu-jitsu manner without having enough of a skill level to master both boxes and then make the certain modifications and changes. And if I had to pick one, it would be a Tomonagi, because at least if you fuck that up, you're in guard.
Yeah, right. Right. And that's precisely what I wanted to ask you about too. I'm really glad you went there with this, because as you said, it's important to approach different sports and respect them for what they are, and try not to tell yourself, yeah, I already kind of understand how this works due to my pre-existing experience in sport A or sport B. It's good to show up with a fresh slate and say, look, I'm going to learn this from the ground up, from the base. Once you get going, though, I feel like, yeah, obviously, if you're a jiu-jitsu guy and you want to learn some throws and be real efficient with them, there's going to have to be some modification, as you mentioned, because you could land yourself potentially in a position that's not favorable to you on the ground. Like, you might score the takedown, but then the position you end up being in might not be super favorable. At what point in your skill development, when you're learning throws properly, do you then start applying them with modifications in jiu-jitsu without screwing the whole thing up?
When you start having success in the individual sport, that tells you that you have enough of an understanding of how somebody of the same level as you, just as skilled as you're competing with, when they're clearly not trying to be thrown, you're able to get this technique off. That tells me that you, as an individual, have the ability to set it up, recognize when to do it, and have the skill to pull it off against somebody who directly understands what it is you're trying to do and preventing it. If you can do that, then you can come back over into the other sport and say, hey, I know this well enough to understand what things I need, like what's the recipe of things that have to happen in order to get this technique to work. If I can mimic that recipe over here, but in a different way to keep me safe, then great, I can do it. But you have to understand what it's going to take. And the only way to do that is through like actual trial and error.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And anytime I've tried to like take a technique from judo and teach people like how to modify it for jiu-jitsu and get it to work, it's never successful, because the main reason why it works is because you have that presence and that feel of a threat that I'm going to take somebody down with this. The stand-up game isn't as simple as like, I put my hook here and I tilt them to the side and we roll over, because they have the ability to be on their feet and widen their base, change their base in like a split second. The stand-up portion has to be instinctual.